right, so we'll get underway with this first panel, and thank you to our keynotes for that very illuminating set of presentations. So, more work obviously needs to be done around enabling evidence production. There are opportunities certainly to build stronger linkages to clinical and operational experts and to contextualize this information. We need to focus on the speed of the process of evidence production, to be sure, given the rate of technological innovations and adoption, and we need to focus on increasing the impact. And so doing, we're going to hopefully be able to save time, money, promote system efficiencies, and get new technologies into practice where the clinicians, the teams, and Albertans can have access to them to improve person-centered care and health outcomes. And together, then, we can have the evidence necessary to elevate our healthcare system. I want to introduce this panel, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce them all in a row right away so we can hand one off to another and give them their 5 to 7 minutes of opening presentations, and then we'll go straight into a Q&A process. So really happy to have this panel to moderate. We have some very capable people at this table to open exchange ideas among evidence producers. And a little bit more about our panelists now. So Dr. Fiona Clement is an associate professor and the director of Health Technology Assessment Unit within the Department of Community Health Sciences at the University of Calgary. Her work includes health policy development on many topics important to Canadians. I know she did work on the cannabis piece that was mentioned earlier. She has received numerous accolades in the fields, including select as one of the 12 Harkness Fellows internationally, the Maurice McGregor Award for Outstanding Leadership and Excellence in HTA, and more recently Calgary's Top 40 Under 40 for her work in health policy. We have Dr. Korownyk at the end, who is an associate professor in the Department of Family Medicine at the University of Alberta. She has worked as a family physician for the past 10 years and is actively involved in the development of tools of practice, CPD roadshows, and academic detailing visits with the evidence program. She is also involved in graduate and undergraduate medical education at the U of A. Her research interests include practical questions related to the improvement of primary care. And finally, the wonderful and talented Dr. Blair O'Neill, who's currently the Associate Medical Officer for all strategic clinical networks in Alberta. He's held numerous healthcare leadership roles, including the Director of Cardiac Cath Labs of the Victoria General Hospital, Chief of the Division of Cardiology at the QE2 Health Sciences Center Division, and Director for the U of A's Division of Cardiology and for the Mazankowski Alberta Health Institute. He served as the President of the Canadian Cardiovascular Society and was instrumental in setting the targets for cardiovascular services and procedures which have been adopted nationally. He's also chaired the Canadian Cardiovascular Society Quality Initiative, which has established common data definitions for cardiovascular registries in Canada. With that, I'm going to hand it over to our panel, and I believe the order is we will have Dr. Clement start first.
Okay. Chris said we could stay sitting.
Yes.
We're going to actually just address from our seating positions, if that's okay with everybody. So I'm going to take my time just to talk a little bit about what a producer does, and then talk about some of the things that I think are required to be successful from my standpoint. So I have the best job in the world. I am based at the University of Calgary, and we're privileged to have 3 HTA units in the province. So one at the University of Calgary, one at the University of Alberta led by Dr. Menon, and then the IHE under Dr. McCabe's leadership. When we talk about an evidence producer, really my job is to respond to policymaker needs for information. So we look at evidence very broadly, including clinical effectiveness, so what you might traditionally think of in terms of systematic reviews, looking at randomized control trials or observational cohorts. We also look at economic information, whether that's looking at already published economic evaluations or doing de novo economic evaluations and modeling. We importantly include the patient perspective. So again, that can be either synthesized from literature already published or else gathered in a primary data collection method such as focus groups or interviews or surveys sometimes. And then we also incorporate the provider perspective. So again, that's usually interviews with clinicians or practicing physicians saying, how would this impact your practice? What do you think would need to change for you to be able to implement this successfully? What support would you need to change your practice to not do this anymore? Those kinds of questions. We then compile all of that information together to come up with policy options and recommendations or paths forward for whoever has asked us the question. And because we're getting pushed more and more into the implementation science realm where they say, well, those are great, how would I actually get any traction on that particular path forward? We then can also look at implementation success stories or implementation failure stories if they're out in the literature, or hypothesize kind of what would be facilitators or barriers. So from that, you've probably gathered it's a team sport, which is part of why I love what I do. So I have a very capable, strong, highly skilled team around me in a variety of different disciplines to be able to tackle all those different perspectives. And then, of course, we're only one member of the broader ecosystem. So my job is to synthesize evidence. There are other people who produce evidence. So within our research community, for example, we need people who are doing randomized control trials, people who are doing cohort studies, people who are working with patients in their focus group settings, those kinds of things. And then we also need policymakers who are interested enough in evidence and know that we exist so that we can connect up. So that's kind of the way that I see the ecosystem and where we fit. From my perspective, there's really three things that contribute to a successful HTA partnership. The first being relationships. And I mean, I've already said HTA is a team sport. You have to be a strong, cohesive team that's all paddling or rowing or shooting, whatever you want to say, in the right direction together. And so my relationships are foundational to my ability to be able to work in this space. Timing is everything. On my end, we have to be nimble, so it doesn't help advance a relationship or bring evidence to a table when I get called and asked a question and I say, I can't support that, the timelines are too short. So it's always a negotiation and a thoughtful conversation around what's possible within the timelines that you have, what's good enough for you to bring forward to the table. If we can't be as comprehensive as all of those evidence types that we've talked about, what is the most important thing for you to bring to the table? Is it the economics? Is it the patient perspective? Could we cut some corners around the clinical stuff and look at previous systematic reviews? So it's a constant negotiation, recognizing on my part, which was something I had to learn, decisions will get made when they're going to get made. The world doesn't wait for me. And so if I want evidence that I can synthesize at the table, it has to be ready when the decision is going to be made. The third thing that I think is really important and contributes to success in this area is listening. So I'm trained as a researcher, I'm PhD trained, spent a lot of time in academics, and we speak a different kind of language than policymakers or decision makers. We work at a different pace, and we have different expectations. And so I am constantly trying to listen, and I mean like really listen, to hear what the policymaker needs, what their objectives are, and then trying to figure out what I can do to support them. So those are the things that I wanted to highlight, and I'll pass on to Blair.
Thank you very much, Fiona. That's a great summary. So I just wanted to, and I know many of you in this audience will be quite aware of what strategic clinical networks are about. But you know, we're certainly engines of innovation, engines of quality, part of the health technology assessment process for the province, certainly big into knowledge translation and trying to eliminate those gaps, and trying to change the paradigm from technology being pushed upon us to more of a demand pull type of situation, where whether it's a researcher that we want to help answer a pressing clinical question, or it's an industry vendor that has a new machine that goes beep, we want to better define what actual patient care gaps exist, because part of our core committees, part of our working groups are actually patient advisors who help us be much more patient-centered than other parts of our organization. And so we have had opportunities to do that, to sit down with industry partners and to co-design protocols that allow a technology to be introduced, but not just randomly, but introduced into a clinical pathway so that there's some order to it, so that you can actually assess the value of new technology introduced. Specific example with our critical care strategic clinical network, at a core committee level, identified delirium, patient delirium delirium in an ICU as being a major marker of bad outcomes, often permanent cognitive impairment in patients who survived with their delirium. And so identified that to industry partner. Industry partner said, well, we're about early detection of sepsis, and sepsis is a major risk factor for delirium in the ICU. Could we work together? Many meetings later, it's not easy. We've actually co-designed a protocol working with our provincial lab partners, working with our emergency room partners to come up with a protocol that'll allow their technology to be introduced in a controlled fashion, become part of an antibiotic stewardship program, so that actually that's where the value will be proven, because the cost savings from inappropriate use of antibiotics or selection of the wrong antibiotics that are quite expensive agents will allow the value for that protocol to be proven, and we have established evaluation markers to show that that's actually the case. As part of the HTA process, I sit at our provincial committee, the Health Technology Assessment Committee for the province, and I represent one of the things about SCN's strategic clinical networks is they are clinically led, often by a senior medical director who's a retreaded division section department head like me, who's been in the trenches, who has that clinical expertise, but can function as neutral Switzerland along with the rest of their team, so that when a new technology comes to the table for assessment or for reassessment, because as that's been mentioned several times, that's an incredible part of this process. If we're going to make room in a zero-sum game system, we have to eliminate things that are now become low value. And so that's, again, what SCNs can bring to the table. We're all about innovation. Just isn't about new shiny tools. It can be. There's no question we continue to need them. But there's an excellent graph by a physician by the name of Chris Trimble that actually shows the cost per relative gain since the 1940s, essentially. And so in the 1940s, penicillin was pretty cheap, so you got an immediate, very big bang for your buck as far as what you were spending. I lived through aspirin and acute coronary syndrome. It was 50% mortality reduction by giving a patient aspirin. There ain't any aspirins, there ain't any penicillins anymore, so how do we pull that curve down? It's effectively by improving the processes of care and taking best practices and introducing them. And so we have had several examples of that. So antipsychotics are often used for medical restraint in elderly patients with significant cognitive problems in long-term care. It can control the behavior, but unfortunately, it renders them virtually non-communicative to their family members. And there was a pilot project done in Manitoba. Remember, Canada is the land of pilot projects. Our seniors network realized the potential value of this, introduced it, along with audit and feedback, had to agree on the appropriate metrics. But a lot of studies have shown audit and feedback isn't enough. You have to provide providers with tools because they're very busy, and the ability to come together and discuss and peer review and benchmark how they're doing versus others. So at the beginning of this program, we were about the worst in the country, over 30% use. Tremendous variation across the province. 11 early adopter sites that were brought on board. We used a classic IHI learning collaborative, bringing people together, agreeing on what each center's metrics would be to determine how to get patients off their inappropriate use of antipsychotics. And we went from worst to best, spread this and scaled it across all 120 long-term care units in the province, and now we're the best, 18%. The other thing, though, Edmonton and Calgary were the best, but even Edmonton and Calgary showing there is no limit to better. Edmonton and Calgary continue to improve, even though they were the best at the beginning, showing that we can always do better if we measure ourselves, provide providers with tools to do that. The other one, and I particularly am proud of this one because I was the senior medical director for the cardiovascular health and stroke network, basically used, when we first launched the network, we saw that stroke 30-day mortality, again, if you were in Edmonton and Calgary, probably best in the country. If you were outside Edmonton and Calgary, you want to hide that data. It was not very good. So we're one provincial healthcare system. It's not fair that just because you present with your stroke in Red Deer or Grand Prairie or Medicine Hat that your outcome is not going to be as good as somebody in Edmonton and Calgary. What was the difference? Was it TPA? No, that only applies to about 8 to 12% of patients. It's the post-stroke care that makes the big difference. What is the difference in Edmonton and Calgary? Dedicated stroke units. Well, nowhere else has big enough plants, meaning hospitals, facilities, to dedicate a unit to stroke care. So how do we bring stroke unit equivalent care to rural Alberta? And that was what that project was all about. Basically, again, agreeing on what were the major things that if you provided that to a patient after a stroke, you would avoid complications and you'd improve outcomes. And that was coupled in the larger centers where we could support it with something called early supported discharge, so that the same providers, the physio, the OT, the speech language pathologist, could actually follow those patients into the community. And so we basically proved that despite a pretty prohibitive geography that we have here in Alberta, so really an example to the rest of the country, indeed the rest of the world, because not everybody lives in a metropolitan area, you could improve stroke care by providing stroke unit equivalent care, again, providing a dashboard that everybody agrees to, providing providers with the tools, because when we come to work, we want to do the right thing. We just never know how good a job we're doing unless we have the data to show it. So that's knowledge translation, because that data existed, but until the network presented it to providers and said, we can help you do a better job because we know you want to do a better job. We improve stroke care across the province amazingly. So those are some of the things. You can do the right thing. You have to be systematic about it. You have to define it properly, but it is possible. Thank you.
All right, thank you. That was, some great initiatives. All right, so I thought I would start with just quickly reflecting on some of what we heard from our keynotes today. First, when Brian spoke, a lot of really interesting, exciting, and potentially expensive developments on the horizon I saw, which was really interesting. My background is primary care, so I'm a primary care physician. That's the lens that I view everything in. So one of the comments that Brian made was that of these new medications that are coming out, about 35% will be specialty medications. And so in my mind, I flipped that, and what that tells me is about 65% of those every year will be applicable to potentially primary care. If there's 45 new drugs being approved every year, that's about 30 new drugs that I might need to learn about in a primary care setting. So that sort of brings me into that idea of information overload in a primary care setting. And I work with a peer group, and how we started out years ago was looking at how do we teach evidence-based medicine to residents. And when we started doing that, we looked at what resources do practitioners use when they're trying to answer questions. And we found a couple of things. One, they spend on average less than 2 minutes answering a question. So resources that are presented to them need to be brief, succinct, and really to the point. If you just wanted to read relevant information around evidence, and this was an analysis done over 10 years ago, it said you would need about 21 hours a day. So that's impossible. If you just looked at guidelines, so currently guidelines, especially often directed to primary care, have multiple recommendations. And another group assessed the current guidelines in the market, that was about 5 years ago, and said you need about 18 hours a day in order to carry out all the chronic disease and screening recommendations in these guidelines. So we recognize in a primary care setting, we're often the target of many recommendations, many new drugs, many new things that come our way, and there's an appearance that we're at times failing to incorporate all of this into our practice. And we know if you look, different American groups have suggested there's over 120 specialties and subspecialties in medicine. So even if they did a new guideline every couple of years, just imagine in the primary care setting, how do we keep up with all of this information? So, and then to the point that Sean made, which I thought was fabulous, is that idea of there's so much information out there, but there's only a small percentage of it that's actually relevant and useful to our management and what we're doing in primary care. So what have we done to try to address this? So the group I work with, PEER, which is an evidence-based medicine group, as we began to note some of these difficulties in primary care, we collaborated with other groups like TOP in Alberta, the Alberta College of Family Physicians, and looked at the development. How can we provide primary care practitioners with succinct evidence that's applicable to primary care? So the first thing we did is we developed something called Tools for Practice, which is a one-page summary. It has the bottom line at the top bolded, because we know most people won't read beyond that. And it's distributed to over 30,000 physicians every 2 weeks, and we have about a 50% open rate. So we know about half the physicians are at least opening it. We can't measure change, we haven't measured change to practice per se, but we are hoping that there is at least some information that's being passed along. Based on that, we also looked at the development of guidelines. We have published 2 guidelines so far. They're called simplified guidelines. So the first one we did was 2 pages long. The first one we published in the Canadian Family Physician remained the #1 read article in that journal for a year and a half. So it speaks to the idea that primary care might have an appetite for simplified, easy to read, brief documents that give them evidence. And again, because we're not so much in a policy setting, our goal is really to provide evidence. We're not suggesting this or this. We're saying, here's the evidence, you make an informed decision. And we find that practitioners respond fairly well to that. We've started a conference. We do a conference where each speaker can talk no more than 20 minutes because, again, succinct, brief, that's all you want to hear, which is one of the biggest in Alberta. And we began a cost document as well, just informing us of prices. And in response to that question around research, so one of the areas we've noticed there is a big need for research is in primary care. So a lot of our research comes out of sort of tertiary care settings. There's a lot more money. Some of those topics are way more sexy than primary care. Basic primary care, there's not as much research. And so our group, I've worked with, we collaborate with Pragmatic Trials, and we've started one of the first primary care pragmatic trials, one of the largest in Canada, actually, looking at a simple question about blood pressure. When's the best time to give it? So trying to address some of those issues, and those are some of the things that we're looking at, just trying to improve that goal that Kat has sort of identified as closing that gap between evidence and actual practice.
Thanks very much, Tina. We have an army of briefing note writers in our department that we could contract out to you to synthesize a lot of that complex information, and we're pretty good at it. So now is the point of the panel where we would like to get questions from you, the audience, to ask these panel members. And while you're thinking about your questions, I'll get it all started and ask Fiona, how have HTA products evolved to support implementation?
That's a great question. Thank you, Justin. So I think about 3 things that don't directly answer your question, but that have really changed in the way I think about HTA and the evidence that we put out. So the first is that the messaging really matters, and this really builds on what Tina was saying, that the appetite for people to read 300-page documents is very low. And so despite our need to put that out there to really support in a very technical, scientific way, the messaging and our findings, generally, if you can't say it in 3 sentences or less, you've already lost your audience. And so for us, really thinking about what are the main messages coming out of this evidence, what does the person really need to know out of these 300 pages, and then the very interested reader can go to the website or can go to our publications and find all of that detail. So the messaging has changed substantially. The other thing that I think about is the messenger. So who is delivering our findings? And there are different people who are better or worse champions or have the right kind of position or the right kind of voice to deliver different kinds of messages. And so really thinking about who is effectively placed to share the message and to advance the cause or to kind of bring forward the evidence and bring it to life has been something that we've been very purposeful about thinking about. And then the last piece is really around readiness of the context. So, we often will get a call and say, well, we want some policy work in this particular area. And after a few initial conversations, it becomes very clear that there are different champions in the area, perhaps different hospitals or different units or different branches of the ministry as examples. And they may be at different levels of engagement within the policy file. They may have very different ideas about what the question that they're asking is or the direction that it needs to go, and really working on building that readiness to receive the evidence messages and the evidence product at the end very early, and bringing along those stakeholders on our journey changes the implementation, the uptake, and the interest and the receptivity of the end product. So again, being very strategic about building that hunger and that desire and readiness really to receive evidence as we go along. So those are the three things that we've kind of been working on.
Thank you. Sean?
Yeah. So possibly a very naive question. It's been a long time since I've done primary care, but it seems like a recurring theme heard last night at dinner, today, lots of places, is just how overburdened the primary care clinicians are, and therefore, how critical it is to try to find, very efficient ways to kind of intervene. And I was just thinking in terms of, this whole conversation too about low value care and reassessment. And I just wonder, are there big chunks of time that primary care clinicians are spending on things that are low value? So it feels like, we keep trying to, the hard drive is almost full and we're trying to, add small additional files. But isn't there a lot of junk in there that we could just clear out? And so anyway, I apologize if it's an insulting question, but I'm just curious if people are thinking about that.
If I can, I love your question, and actually we just published a paper on that, and it was originally entitled Misplaced Priorities in Primary Care, but no one really liked that title. They thought it was a little bit too negative. So now it's sort of competing opportunities and challenges in primary care, which addresses that. And we sort of did a brief analysis looking at that idea of every specialty wants us to screen for their top 5 concerns, whether it's family violence, it's sun exposure, it's depression, anxiety. And if you look at what is the evidence for outcomes in there, many of them have absolutely no evidence for patient-oriented outcomes. And so you're looking at the recommendations for screening and chronic disease management. And we sort of did brief analysis that over a lifetime, in practice, how many lives would I save doing that? Even screening for things where there is evidence, screening for breast cancer and colorectal cancer, the absolute number of lives that I save are limited compared to seeing someone with an acute issue. And so we can prevent patients from, how many emergency visits don't need to be seen in emergency. They could have been seen in primary care if we weren't so busy screening people for anxiety and depression. And so that idea of there's probably, if you look at an evidence-based, more bang for your buck for many things that we aren't prioritizing. And again, if you look at measures and say pay for performance, so if I screen for mammograms, potentially I get a check, but then I don't have room to see this patient with an acute concern. And I think that's a huge issue in our current system, something we need to look at, because we're emphasizing maneuvers that really have limited long-term benefit, many of them. And some of them have absolutely no benefit if you look at the evidence, if you're truly just looking at evidence of patient-oriented outcomes. And yet we emphasize those, and we love the idea of it, but we're not basing it on best evidence.
Yeah, I could just
Sure,
add. I mean, a lot of that question sort of, begs, our incentive mechanisms, and we still are very primitive, I would say. Sorry, Justin, in our exploration of novel funding mechanisms. For instance, I'm in an alternative relationship plan, but the coin of the realm is still fee-for-service billing. So it doesn't change behaviors. In fact, in Nova Scotia, we experimented, and at the beginning, we eliminated a bunch of stress tests and unnecessary tests. Well, then shadow billing came to be coin of the realm, and so we just ramped up again. That's dumb, but so there's a lot of those things that incent you to do things because you've got to touch the patient or lay eyes on the patient when you could be doing something of much higher value, and we have to figure that out. There's no question about that.
Mm-hmm. John?
Yeah, just as one comment, there is the whole issue of overload, which I think is a real problem, and how you kind of reorient funding systems to allow mechanisms to lean design to get some things off the hard drive that is full. But Blair, you brought something up, and there's 2 competing issues that happen, I think, in terms of evidence into practice. One is the evidence-based decision-making, where the evidence is gathered somewhere else, studies done in Sweden, and you get the averages of those, and they're kind of put through and imposed on the particular system. We have to deal with the uptake. The other one, as I remember, was John Gabay from the UK, who had come and spoken at a symposium we had about decision-based evidence making. And rather than taking evidence from away, we have a huge resource within the province to produce our own evidence really actively about what we're doing and reflecting it back on the system itself and through that iterative kind of performance of how we're actually performing. But for the two physicians on the panel, I just was interested on there's sometimes great resistance for that performance reporting back, even if it's anonymized, and just some comments on how do we actively start to report back on the performance of people making those clinical decisions aggressively, and whether you think that might actually allow some transition of care where people know where they are in terms of peers or matching against guidelines.
Do you want to take that first?
Sure. Yeah, that's such a tricky, that's a very good question. So we've had many discussions about that. Part of our discussion is around what are we reporting back to physicians, because as we know, in hospitals, there's many things that are easier to measure. In primary care, sometimes it's very difficult to measure the important things, right? So the patient outcomes that matter, and then the patient preferences and values, and how does that fit into what we do? And those are huge issues, and so we've had big discussions around that in our department. It was the idea of, we've begun a lot of measurement, and the idea, we don't love the measurements that are happening, but we're sort of told, well, we have to start somewhere. So that's one huge issue. And then there's that piece of sometimes a bit of feedback is useful in being able to sort of look at what we've done, oh, maybe I am a bit out of place. But I think the real question for us would be around, what are we measuring, and how do we do that?
Yeah, I mean, good question. I'm a procedurally based physician. I know there's been, because I'm kind of embarrassed to be a quality guy, and we still don't know our own results. So I'm only as good as the last case I did, or as bad as the last one turned out. Our bone and joint orthopedic surgeons in the province have measured their outcomes for some time. There was resistance initially, but now they look forward to their quarterly reports. They're risk adjusted, they're credible. People had to sit in a room and agree what they would be measured on. But you can pick an issue that way. They picked transfusion. We were on the high end in the country. They decided to focus on it, and we've come down. We're not the best in the country, but virtually over 6 months there was a marked reduction in transfusions for patients. Other provinces we know, next door, for instance, Cardiac Services BC brings all the cardiac surgeons together, brings all the interventionalists together once a year to review their data, and the variation in outcomes over 5 years has been reduced incredibly. So it's worthwhile. You have to build that trust a step at a time, and we have to go there. But there's that fear as captain of the ship, you're going to get blamed for it. Where we really, those of us involved or have led care, no, it's that team. You can't think about it as yourself. It's that team care, and we have to improve it. So we have a ways to go. It is possible. There's examples of great success in this province and certainly elsewhere. But in 2018, we have to do it.
Do you have a question?
So certainly agree with the last comments. So with the Surgery Network, we're working on the National Surgery Quality Improvement Program, which is data, and providing that evidence-based data can help work towards that. I wanted to ask a question to those in the panel about the return on investment discussion. So any of the projects that have been generated within the within the networks in general have had to have that return on investment piece, and especially if we're in a zero-sum game. So I just wanted to ask a little bit about that and how that fits into some of those health technology assessment work, or in general, because I think that piece is really important, is what is the value that we're getting for any initiative?
Yeah, excellent question. I can tell you for the first 6, because one of the things I've been quoted as saying, in a zero-sum game system in the public sector, what's the first thing we cut? Research and development, and innovation funding. Whereas in private industry, in the oil patch, have they been cutting R&D? No siree. That's their investment into their survival. So we have to figure that out. But as the Naylor report, David Naylor on research and innovation in Canada pointed out, if you expect operators to give up dollars that could get another hip and knee done, they're not going to do it willingly. So we have to find a way to fund this sort of research and development, and we've had Alberta Innovates in this province that has certainly helped us through leaner times. The return on investment question is a very good one. We know with the first 6, because about $20 million was cut out of the operating budget back in 2011, 2012, invested in the SCN, 10 million in infrastructure, 10 million in project money. You've heard about 2 of them, AUA, the appropriate use of antipsychotics and stroke action plan. For those dollars invested, there was roughly a 2.3 to 1 return on investment. So, showing that there is value there. What we have to get better at, and what our executive leadership team, and one of my bosses is sitting in the back, so I have to choose my words carefully, but I know she's a supporter, is how do we invest some of those dollars? I mean, we're all worried about the common deficit of the overall Alberta Health Services, but micro investment into teams that are able to save dollars, realize there's other areas where they'd like to invest it, that would be a very good thing, I think in my opinion. And indeed, our whole Connect Care clinical information system is going to be partially funded on a benefit sharing model. So we have to figure out how do we introduce gain sharing into our system, so that if you produce value, if you produce savings within the system, that you as a local team can benefit. Maybe not 100%, because if we do have a organizational-wide deficit, then we need to deal with that as well. So I think you raise a very good point. We certainly, in the SCN world, our DNA is about measurement, so we are pretty good at telling at the end of the day. We have organizations like IHE that have measured us, our various projects, ERAS, the return on investment is incredible. So those things happen, but we have to figure out how to, like, fee-for-service is not a great incentive model for docs. The block funding, site-based funding, historic-based funding is not the best way to fund a healthcare system either, and we have to figure out how to get a little more creative and innovative about that as well.
Fiona?
Yeah, so I was just going to weigh in on kind of the concept of return on investment, and my roots are in health economics, so it's like fundamental to everything that I do in my life. The idea, and Dr. Tunis spoke about it earlier, that you can only spend $1 once. And so when we think about how much of our provincial spend, it's about 43% of the budget is spent on healthcare at the moment. And as that creeps up, everything else that we're spending on in our social sector has to decrease, or it's crowded out. And so I think when we're thinking about how we spend money, we need to be thinking about what are we going to get for this investment, or what are we going to get for the efforts that we're putting in here. And it's not just money, it's time too. We only have so many hours in the day, and if the amazing surgery SCN is devoting their energy towards improving care over here, they are not devoting their energy to this plan over here or this strategic initiative over here, and that's just the reality of scarce resources. One of the things that I'm very excited to see happening, and is, I think, a shift, is using the idea of return on investment as kind of a go, no-go decision-making tool. So thinking about in advance, before we move forward on this project, what do we think it's going to take for us to get there in terms of manpower, resources, dollars? What do we expect to get? And looking critically at that, saying, is that worth it? So as an example, if you had to invest $2 million and 2,000 man-hours in a particular initiative, and you knew up front the savings that you might achieve or the value that you might get back is, say, $50,000, is that worth it for you? And you may well say, yes, it is important enough to patient safety that we are moving forward anyways, but at least you've thought about it and you've put it on the table that what's pushing us here and what's motivating us here is not savings or cost reductions or cost avoidance at the end of the day. It's about patient safety, for example. So I'm really excited to see us adopting a lens like that when we think about prioritizing and starting initiatives, so that we can think about achieving the best return on the investments that we're making.
Thank you. Anything else? No? All right. I think that's it for questions, so please join me in thanking the panel here today.